Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Campus Conservative. Today, we have an excellent guest on today, very popular, Satan. No, I'm just kidding around, not actually Satan, but he plays Satan phenomenally on the hit show Supernatural. He's been on other hit shows like Lost, and he's been in a slew of excellent movies, and he is also the co-founder of the new third party, the Capitalist Party, Mark Pellegrino. Mark, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, man. How you doing?
I'm doing excellent. What about you?
Good. Just staying out of the sunshine. It's about 90 degrees out here in Los Angeles, and that's a little too hot for my taste.
I can never bear that LA heat, but Mark, I just wanted to jump right into it today and talk a little bit about some old news from last week because I think it's still relevant. So Sally Griffin, last week it came out with pictures of her in the media holding a model of Trump's head. It was decapitated. It was all bloody. And I just wanted to gather your thoughts on that.
First, a disclaimer, I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump. I voted for the guy that would do the least amount of damage to the country, or so I felt, the Libertarian candidate. So this isn't in any way a partisan, my comment doesn't come from partisan affiliation at all. I, like most people with an ounce of sense, thought it was... it really pressed the boundaries of taste and was a pretty horrific thing to do. But I think the left is fairly apoplectic. I think hell hath no fury like a leftist who has lost an election that they thought they were going to win. So, they're acting out like crazed, rabies-ridden children right now. And the rhetoric that sort of built up to it is partly responsible. I mean, people have been saying from his inauguration onward that they want to see this guy dead. They want coups. They've been advocating for violence from the time this man was inaugurated. So this just seems to be sort of the unfortunate result of a lot of violent and aggressive rhetoric that's been going on for months.
And I agree, but it just seems as if the left is getting worse and worse and worse. We even heard reports that Barron Trump saw this and that he thought it was real for a second and he was inconsolable, which is something you never want to hear. It's the guy's kid. At the end of the day, when no matter what you think of Trump, it is his kid. It's sad. But you also mentioned something that I found very interesting earlier on. You said you're not really conservative. You're not a Trump supporter either. So I wanted to know, because it seems as if to me, for people who don't know your political standing, and I don't want to misrepresent you here, so you correct me but if I'm wrong, but it seems as if you take on the perspective of Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who said in an interview once, we hate conservatives, but we effing hate liberals.
I mean, I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't use that kind of rhetoric. I certainly think liberals and conservatives are cut from the same cloth, and conservatives are a bit derivative morally. I don't hate them because there's some constitutional conservatives who I think have their feet firmly planted on the ground, and there's some folks in the conservative camp who are sort of understand market dynamics enough to appeal to me, that's for sure. And I don't find anything of a similar dynamic on the left. So I can't say I hate conservatives. I certainly don't agree with the majority of them, but I don't hate them.
So then I want to gather your feelings more on the left before we start talking about the right more. What do you hate the most about the left?
Their animating moral philosophy, which is altruism. They're consistent practitioners of the sacrifice of the individual to a quote-unquote common good, and I find that despicable. And that's what I despise more than anything, and that's one area where I think most conservatives cannot really effectively fight the left, because they more or less have adopted altruism as their moral code. It's mostly religious altruism. It's not secular altruism like the left practices. But the fact that they adopt it and makes them nearly incapable of of actually addressing the fight with the left on the grounds that it needs to be addressed on, which is moral, not practical. That's why the conservatives have been losing the statist battle for 120 years, because they're constantly fighting the encroachment of statism on practical grounds, while saying out of the other side of their mouth, "We agree with you, we just don't think it works." And that's no way to win a fight.
And I totally agree with that. You know, we see some conservatives, and I bet this boils your blood, it boils mine. We see some conservatives giving the left credence, saying, you know, communism is a good idea, it just doesn't work.
Yes, boils my blood.
But, you know, you state that conservatives have been losing this fight against statism for the past 120 years, and that conservatives take on more of that they take on a sense of altruism just like the left. I challenge that belief, just in the sense that we haven't really seen anything like American conservatism until like the last 30 years, since the days of Reagan, since the days Reagan implanted that thought in the American people's minds of small government. You know, we didn't really see the emergence of this new American conservatism since the 30s, 60s, 70s, 80s. You know, because the GOP used to be the party of tariffs. You know, both sides, until really the 50s, were way to the left. So I don't think it's fair to say that conservatives have been losing this fight for 120 years.
Well, first of all, I'd ask you: Did Ronald Reagan shrink the size of the welfare state?
Well, he shrank.
Did he do anything to materially shrink government?
Yes, he shrank it in certain domestic areas, certain welfare programs, but then he expanded it, as we all know, in other places like the military-industrial complex, and a lot of places on foreign policy, and a lot of places on foreign policy programs.
He shrank. He shrank the rate of growth, but it grew nonetheless. Government has not stopped growing since the advent of the progressive era, and there's nothing that the right has done to contribute to its downfall. They contribute to its proliferation. So, as far as I'm concerned, there hasn't been anybody on the right who's been able to fight the good fight for individualism, because they don't believe in individualism themselves. So, until we get people on the right understanding the nature of individualism and disavowing altruism altogether, they will never win anything more than skirmishes and battles which won't effectively change the political landscape.
Well, I think that's a bit unfair to say. And again, I agree with you that Reagan, at the end of the day, didn't contribute to a smaller government overall, but he did decrease domestic programs. He did decrease programs at home. It was his main bulk of government growth came from expanding the military to deal with Soviet Russia. It came from military programs such as Star Wars, again, to deal with the Soviet Union.
It came from everywhere. You're acknowledging it yourself. It came from everywhere. He slowed the rate of growth. That means it's still growing. So there was no effective stoppage of government growth at all. In fact, it burgeoned and strengthened and became larger under President Reagan.
Yes.
Not that he didn't say things that I think were great. I think he articulated a message that was quite interesting, but that has been contaminated from the very beginning. I mean, from the origins of our country. So he was certainly ideologically one of the more interesting presidents to occupy the office in the last 100 or so years, but he did nothing to effectively change the political landscape.
Well, I disagree that he did nothing to change the political landscape. And to finish my final thoughts, I agree. At the end of the day, Reagan did not shrink the government in totality, and I'm actually writing a book on this, how there's never truly been a conservative president. But he shrank it in some areas, he allowed it to increase in others, and that increase outweighed that decrease. And I agree with you there, I do. It's just, I think you have to give the man some credit. But in terms of saying he didn't change the political landscape, here's where I especially disagree with you. While he may have not changed anything politically, because, you know, nowadays we see liberals and populists using Reaganonian conservatism as a kind of mask. They talk like they're Reagan conservatives, but they're not really. What he did was he implanted within the American people's minds a large section of them, that philosophy of small and limited government, that philosophy of actual conservatism, even if in some areas he did not practice it himself, and it's what a lot of American people and a lot of the American right, not the politicians, because the politicians are politicians, but what a lot of people on the American right as citizens demand, that smaller government that he implanted into, or that belief in smaller government that he implanted into the political sphere.
Yeah, I mean, like then that's sort of what I said. I think the words that he uttered in his speeches were a profound indictment against the system as it was, and certainly an endorsement of the traditional founding principles. And to that degree, he was far more advanced than most presidents we've had in the office. But his actions, of course, are what we have to measure him by, and the results of his actions are what we have to measure him by. And as far as I'm concerned, those were not, measurable improvements. Certainly, the idea of deregulating certain industries was good, and certainly stimulated the economy and stimulated the march toward freedom. But it didn't last long. I mean, the Reagan Revolution, to the extent that it existed, lasted about 6 years, and it's fallen under the thumb of really steady march towards greater and greater statism. They haven't won the intellectual and moral fight.
I agree with you there, and I think one of the reasons, taking altruism aside for a second, one of the reasons the right hasn't won the political fight, and one of the reasons primarily conservatives haven't won the political fight, I don't think it's just because of altruism. It's because the right has this tendency to go for rhetoric and ignore the broader policy of the candidates that they're putting into office, or throughout history, I think more specifically within the past 20 years, but throughout history, it seems as if the right will go, I guess you could say, with the reasoning that we saw in this election, just to a lesser extent, not as extreme an extent, of voting for the lesser of two evils. Putting someone into power who they see as a lesser evil than the guy who he's running against, or putting someone who in power who talks conservative and talks about individual rights and talks about actually shrinking government, but doesn't really do that. So one of the reasons the right isn't winning is because politics gets in the way. And politics will always get in the way because there's rarely a politician that will actually cede his power in exchange for giving the people more individual rights.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. That's why I am suspicious of anybody who seeks political power. I've been having talks with somebody who's running for the Senate in Missouri and has been vacillating back and forth as to whether to run as a libertarian, a Republican, or under the American Capitalist Party emblem. And I had a long and interesting conversation with his campaign manager that more or less pointed to politics as usual. But look, the two parties have set up a monopoly of ideas. They've made it impossible for any competing ideas or nearly impossible for any competing political ideology to come onto the market of ideas, and as a result, it's nearly impossible for a third party to stick its little head up without getting it legally and politically cut off. So, unfortunately, many people who sound moral folks who are in the libertarian movement and in even the budding capitalist movement that I'm starting don't feel that they will have the kind of clout that they'll need to affect any change unless they get absorbed into one of the major political parties and try to change it from within, and then possibly change their party denomination once they're in office. So that's what we're facing right now. I do believe politics is binary. I think there's basically two alternatives, statists and individualists, and I think the entrance of my party into the fray would actually coalesce the statists from the left and the right into a singular statist party, and those free market, liberty loving and individualists would come to my party. So I mean, I do think it's sort of a myth that multi-party system is somehow more effective or more interesting or gives people options. There's really two options, out there, which our two-party system is supposed to reflect, but doesn't. And they've made it hard through election regulation and for other ideas to come up and serve as a real opposition force.
So I've actually read some of the policy that the Capitalist Party supports, and I did want to ask you, just because it showed a striking resemblance to me to the Libertarian Party, and I wanted to ask you really quick, and I'm glad you actually brought up the Capitalist Party again. What is the difference that you see, maybe other than politics, or the politics of how it would be run? What's the difference you see between your party and the Libertarian Party?
Well, libertarianism sort of encompasses a spectrum of paradoxical ideas and relationships of the individual to the government. But I would say the most consistent libertarians are anarchists. They believe the government is a coercive monopoly, and as such will always be a coercive monopoly in the sense that it will violate individual rights. And they point to taxation as just one simple example of the fact that being forced to support a government entity takes away its nature as a restrained institution and automatically makes it initiator of force. So for them, no government entity is viable. It will always violate your rights. The only effective solution to conflict resolution is the market. So for them, it's just a matter of the deals that individuals make, and capitalism is not that. Capitalism requires objective law and an institution restrained by a constitution, of course, where we invest our retaliatory force in. So, as individuals, we relegate our right of retaliatory force to an institution that is the repository of objective law. I mean, that's how we maintain civilization. I don't bust you over the head when I'm mad. If I have a grievance with you, I turn to the government, I file my grievance, and a third party adjudicates it. It's called due process. It's the raising of reason above whim. And so the capitalist world requires government for its effective enforcement, so that property rights are clear, and so that human action is clear, and so that the parameters of force are clear. And none of that is a requirement in the libertarian world. They chafe at it, even to the extent that if you say, would you support with your tax dollars a rights-respecting government? So the presumption automatically at the outset of the discussion is it's a rights-respecting government. They say no, because it's a monopoly, and a monopoly, they use the economic formulation of monopoly in the political world, where an economic monopoly takes out competition to the detriment of individual choice. A monopoly of force takes out violent actors, which means that a monopoly in government is sort of the way it would be and the way it has to be, and the way it would inevitably go. And you can sort of see this in the world when you see violent regimes in constant conflict with those who are not violent and basically rights respecting, and the conflict is more or less perpetual until one or the other wins. So that was a rather long explanation, but I hope you sort of got the gist of the difference between anarcho-libertarianism and capitalism with a structure of government that protects rights and property.
So I guess you could call yourself then, and when I say this, from what I see, I agree with you to the extent that from what I see of the modern day libertarian movement, it seems as if it's been taken over by ANCAPs. We've talked about them on this show before, the anarcho-capitalists that basically just believe in the non-aggression principle, and that's it. That's the only law of the land. And at the end of the day, really, you can't do anything about it. But I guess then the Capitalist Party would be more like classical liberalism, in the sense that it's not an anarcho-capitalist standing party, but more of I guess you could say, libertarianism, where they believe in, again, a morally right government that upholds the rights of its people, but a small government that upholds social liberties.
Well, the government can still be large. It's just restrained to act only in retaliation. So it only points the gun at criminals, not at citizens who have things that other citizens want. Look, the NAP principle doesn't even make any sense when it comes to market values. I mean, because the object of a market is to please the customer. NAP is no longer an objective principle when the object is to please the customer. And how do you please somebody who is an adherent of Sharia law? By adhering to NAP? Of course not. How do you please somebody who's an adherent to communism or socialism or any form of legalized theft by an institution? By appealing to NAP? Never. Never. So there's not a single anarcho-capitalist that I know that can condemn any of these social systems. They use consent and NAP as synonymous with reason and as synonymous with right, and by doing that, obliterate the concepts of reason and right altogether. So I haven't known a single libertarian yet that me and my fellow objectivists have had massive discussions with online that have not in the end been nihilistic, unprincipled, whim-worshipping negativists, to be honest with you. I haven't met a one. And there's some libertarians that I listen to on a regular basis who I haven't listened to enough to know if they actually stretch into the negativist world, but the ones online certainly do.
So I do have to ask, because you said earlier on, since we're just talking a little bit about libertarianism now, and anyone out there who wants to go check out the Capitalist Party, I urge you to. I don't agree with your party on everything, Mark, on a lot of the social, I guess you could call it social policy. I disagree, but it's very interesting to read about different views, and it's very interesting to believe about starting third parties. But how did you feel about Gary Johnson? I just have to gauge your feelings about him. Because did you feel like the rest of us? I mean, did you feel he was kind of a boob? But the lesser, I guess, of two evils.
Yeah.
What did you think about their candidate?
Yeah, he was moronic. I mean, uninformed, but I don't mind that so much if the man's intentions aren't to exercise his social philosophy all over me. At the point of a gun. And unfortunately, that's what the likes of Trump and Hillary Clinton want to do. And so, the lesser authoritarian to me is the lesser evil. And he was the lesser authoritarian.
Now, I'm no fan of Trump. And I think a lot of people know that. I take the philosophy of objective people in terms of praising him when he does good and condemning him when he does wrong. I guess condemning may be too strong a word, but I can't think of a better one right now. I understand how Hillary Clinton was more of an authoritarian candidate who wanted to force you into her ideology at point of gun. I think that's, even though you said earlier that the conservatives and the left are cut from the same cloth, I think that is more indicative on the left, regardless of how you look at things. But I do want to know, and I understand how Trump, I guess, sympathizes with authoritarians more. He sympathizes more with Erdogan. He congratulated him after that referendum. So I understand that. But in terms of Trump forcing his ideology on you at point of gun, I would like some examples of that and you to bring up some of your grievances there, because I find that very interesting.
Sure. First of all, slapping tariffs on timber from on our Canadian neighbors does nothing to increase the industry the industry of America, or the purchasing power of the average American citizen. If anything, it hurts them. It makes things more expensive. It raises their cost of living, and destroys other industries that weren't anticipated in such a trade deal. That's his way of forcing economic nationalism on me, but this faux nonsensical idea that economic isolationism is somehow a virtue and somehow going to help the American people over open trade, and open borders in that sense, in the sense of being able to trade with other countries. To me, that's somebody who doesn't understand the principles of capitalism and how capitalism flows, and is more interested in scoring rhetorical points and appeasing his nationalistic base at my expense, quite frankly, than in actually working for the prosperity of Americans. So any tariff he imposes on any country, any accusation he makes of currency manipulation, is an attempt on his part to go to economic war. Who pays for that? You and I. Not him. Not even the super wealthy, but the poor, the marginal, the middle class. We're the ones who are going to be thrown on the dust heap of political history. Also, he can score political points with his base. So that's one aspect of him forcing his ideology down my throat at the point of a gun, because there's nothing I can really do about that, right?
That's a good point. That's a good point.
The border situation is another phenomenal mess as far as I'm concerned as a capitalist. To me, it's the same kind of rhetoric used in economic nationalism. It's the conservative obsession with illegal immigration is a way to avoid the elephant in the living room. Sorry to use the political analogy, but the real problem is the welfare state. And of course, we have terrorism, but look, we have so many law enforcement officials who are focused on busting people for vice crimes that we're distracted with pretending that Islamicism isn't dangerous. There's no adequate or rational use of resources in the realm of fighting terrorism, but in the realm of economics, our people, our population, are helped immeasurably by the influx of immigration. Even those who come in here to do menial labor are performing a service and working to support themselves and helping us and raising our standard of living by doing so. So it's another way that Trump and the nationalist Republicans force their ideology down the throats of us American consumers by not allowing us to hire the people whom we can and should hire, who are willing to work, and making our cost of living higher by not allowing this influx of competition. The real monster is the welfare state. Nobody in the Republican Party, nobody in the conservative world, as far as I know, is interested in tackling it. Some of them are interested in decentralizing it a little bit, but decentralizing it to state governments is not taking care of the problem that complete privatization of these organizations would do.
Well, there are a lot of conservative individuals out there, including conservative pundits, who have said numerous times that one of the problems we're seeing with the immigration, I'll just call it for the sake of this conversation, the immigration crisis, or the illegal immigration crisis, is the welfare state, and that it needs to be tackled, not just decentralized. One of those people, I know you don't totally agree with him on a lot, but Ben Shapiro has called not just for decentralizing, taking it back to the states, but that a lot of these welfare programs just need to end. So I think that when you say that, you're more pointing to the Trumpsters and the Trumpster pundits, or the people calling themselves conservatives, who are really, let's just admit it here, populists within the conservative realm, advocating for simply stopping illegal immigration and not at all addressing the welfare state. But I do agree with you on that. I take more of the standpoint that as an American, you don't have a right to a job. You're not entitled to a job. If someone comes in here legally, and I do care about coming in legally, but I've always said that the process for legal immigration should be made easier. And the only reason I care about legal immigration is that people, if you're going to come in this country and live in this country, you should abide by our laws, and you should make that clear. But immigration, the right focusing on immigration isn't totally, I guess you could say, wrong of them. Because this welfare state, this whole thing with the welfare state, it encourages people who do not contribute to the American culture of working hard for what you get. It encourages people to come in here illegally.
Right, but that's not
simply to get that
right.
welfare.
But that's not what they're addressing. They address the illegal immigration problem and its inappropriate competition with the American worker, and their claims that it lowers the standard of living of the everyday average American, when it's quite the opposite. If they did say, "Look, we have a welfare state problem. This is what we need to take care of," then immigration becomes a non-issue. So, I mean, they're using it as a rhetorical bat, to beat up the scapegoat. Both parties have their scapegoats, and that's what I despise about Republicans and about Democrats is they both have scapegoats, and they use those scapegoats quite effectively to promote advances in power in the areas that they think are important. So, for me, conservatives have specific areas where they think the advancement of power is appropriate. The left has their areas where they think the advancement of power is appropriate. Both don't hold the individual as inviolable. They don't think he owns aspects of himself, and are completely or willing to use scapegoats to commandeer those aspects of the individual that they think are important.
Well, here's the thing about addressing illegal immigration. And again, I agree with you that the right isn't adequately addressing the welfare state. But something else they bring up other than unfair competition to American workers, actually the whole thing about unfair competition to American workers, I think it's necessarily stupid when the right argues that about H-1B1 visas or legal immigrants coming in and taking, quote-unquote, taking jobs from Americans. That's a stupid argument. But when they talk about it being unfair that an illegal immigrant came in here and possibly took a job from an American or possibly created unfair competition for an American, I think it's only a good point for the simple fact that it's unfair that one person didn't have to totally follow the law and got ahead because of it. Again, I think the immigration process should be made easier for people to immigrate here legally, but I have a huge problem. I do have a huge problem with people who come here illegally, and I think that is an unfair advantage, the fact that someone's breaking the law and isn't getting punished for it. So I think you should crack down on illegal immigration while making legal immigration that much easier, and the whole thing with the wall doesn't fix that, though I think border security should be made I guess, greater. I think it was General Kelly, a DHS head, who said that it goes past the border and it extends into the countries like Mexico and Brazil and Colombia, where a lot of these immigrants come from. You have to make sure, while not hurting yourself, you still do want to put your country and the individuals in your country first, but you also don't want to hurt them with your economic policy. You want to make sure they thrive so less people are coming here who wouldn't necessarily contribute positively to the culture.
Yeah, I don't know. When I hear contributing to culture, I'm reminded of some rather frightening proclamations from the 1930s fascists. I mean, look, when the law sets you at odds with life itself, something is wrong with the law, and certainly we need to go back to Ellis Island rules, I think. And simplify the process for people, because I think as an individual you have a right to better your condition in life, not at the expense of another, certainly, but if it means getting out of a terrible political situation or one in which your region is dominated by drug cartels, incidentally more or less created by our anti-drug policies, then you should get out of there, and you should try, if you hold your life as a value, to better your condition in life, and laws that make that impossible or take a decade for you to go through a legal process to change your condition in life are awful.
Yes, and I totally agree with that fact of the matter. I agree the legal process should be made easier, but I do find it disingenuous to compare me and other conservatives saying strengthen the culture. It depends on who's saying it. If it's the alt-right saying it, that's definitely a fair comparison. But if it's a normal conservative saying it, I think that's an unfair motive to attribute to us to say that it reminds you of fascists. The whole thing about fascists and in the 1930s, Hitler's regime, and talking about strengthening the culture, that mainly had to do with racial lines. That mainly had to do with, I guess, strengthening the people within your own country and not allowing any outside influences, not allowing anyone outside the country because they were considered inferior to your people. I'm not saying strengthen the culture in terms of a racial or religious or even, I guess, foreign motive here. I'm saying that people who come in should strengthen the American culture of working hard, believing in equal opportunity, not relying on government to get what you want, not trying to steal from others through government suppression to get what you want. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking, and no conservative, actual conservative, when they say immigrants who come in here should strengthen the culture, is talking about it on those racial or religious lines. They're talking about it on those good moral values lines.
Right. If we take apart the welfare state, then the immigrants who come here will be coming here to better their lives by self-sufficient, productive action. And so, just by that act alone, to me, that is the representative culture of America. You're an independent individual, a producer, and that's what defines the American. But there are people in the alt-right, unavoidable at this point, who are certainly ethnically motivated and have quite an intense racial bias. And I'm glad you're not one of those. And I didn't mean to put you into that camp, but culture oftentimes means other things than political ideology.
And I understand that. It's again, it's a good point to bring up. But again, when most people, I know you don't agree with the right on everything, but in all seriousness, when you hear most people on the right talking about strengthening the culture, they're not talking about it on those racial lines or those religious lines. They're talking about it on those strong values lines that I discussed earlier. And anyone, to me, and I think this is becoming adopted not within the populist Trumpian wing, but more so within the conservative wing on the right. If you're willing to come here legally, because again, even though if you eliminate the welfare state, you'll see a decrease in the influx of people who are coming here for that, or for simple government reliance. You still want to make it clear that this is a nation this nation does have laws, and you are going to have to follow some of those laws to be a productive member of society. So again, even though I think we should make the immigration process easier, and even though I agree with you that it needs reform, the welfare state needs to go, and that would solve a lot of problems, you still want to instill a culture of you are an individual, but there are some boundaries in society, i.e. laws, that you're going to have to follow. And if you want to come into this country, you should start by coming in following the law.
I'll buy that.
So I wanted to move on to, I know you probably briefly heard about it. I know since you're an avid capitalist, you really appreciate economic freedom. I wanted to pick your mind about what you thought about Trump withdrawing from the whole Paris Accord.
I mean, I can sum it up in one word: fabulous.
What did you hate the most about the Paris Accord? What did you think was the most just idiotic about it?
Well, I mean, I didn't read the accord point by point for sure, but look, it's just the whole climate change, the whole political apparatus set around climate change, and has one intention, and that is to stifle industry and to destroy capitalism. And so anyone who stands against that nonsense, as far as I'm concerned, is actually acting for the lives for human beings, as opposed to these numbskulls who sanctimoniously stand on their soapboxes and talk about the end of the world. Well, the policies that they enact are responsible for the starvation of millions and millions of people around the world. The first world imposition of bans on GMOs and banning certain agricultural technology and fossil fuels to the third world, or tying loans to third world use of sustainable green technology, or whatever the hell it is they're calling it these days, is keeping them in dire poverty, and keeping administrations that are extremely corrupt in power, and that prevents free enterprise from coming into these countries and liberating these people from poverty and want. So as far as I'm concerned, accidentally he became the savior of a good portion of the world, and as happens with saviors, he's being castigated violently for it by the mob. So That's one thing, and there's a couple of things actually I think Trump is trying to do that are actually beneficial for humanity. They get lost in the leftist hysteria, but they're there, and that's one of them for sure.
Well, that's the whole thing about climate change. Is it is essentially, people bash the right, and you are one of those people for relying too much on religion in their governance. And I agree with you to an extent on that. But climate change, it's not just a religion for the left. It seems as if it's a cult for the left. If you deny anything about it, there's no debate. You're a flat earth science denier. And I don't think you're denying this either. I'm not denying the existence of climate change. I'm just saying I don't know to what extent that humans contribute to it. I don't think there is much of an extent. There's been no concrete evidence shown that we contribute to it in large part. And there's also no evidence to show that the seas are going to flood our lands in the next century. I think it was NASA that showed that the temperature is going to go down half of a degree within 50 years, and then going to go up by 1 degree Celsius in 100 years. So the climate naturally changes. And on top of that, America was one of the only countries on this Paris Accord. It was a non-binding treaty, which Obama didn't even take to the Senate. But we were gutting ourselves while China committed to reducing emissions by 2030, which is something that their economic development was forcing them to do anyway, because you can't live in smog for all of eternity. You can't have an unhealthy population, and they're starting to feel major ramifications for their lack of, I guess, environmental sensitivity to the point that their citizens are getting sick and weak. And India,
Yeah, but just to piggyback on that, sorry to interrupt. It's not government fiat that makes for clean air and clean water and clean industrialization. It's wealth. So, I mean, China's certainly a complicated mix with its political dynamics, but until these poor countries can become wealthy, they're more or less in the condition that Britain and Europe and America were in 150 years ago, when the black fog would descend on London and people died inhaling this toxic mixture of smoke and coal. Well, that changed not because of legislation, but because they got wealthier and were able to invest in cleaner technologies. But the alternative for these people it's much different than the alternative we face. It's pollute or die. And once they get out of that life or death alternative, and are able to invest in more expensive and cleaner technologies, until they're able to do that, they're going to pollute. so what none of these countries seem to acknowledge that wealth and productivity is what will make them cleaner.
of course, I totally agree. But talking as of right now with how China's industry is, their economy is developing. I think it's soon probably going to be India that's the number one carbon pollutant emitter in the world. China's still up there, but they've been developing their economic systems because they can't continue at the pace they've been at. And also we've seen some sense of wealth increase amongst the Chinese population. But I did want to say something really quick because I was going to get to it, and I'm really glad you brought it up. I took an environmental science class just because I was curious. And I heard a lot of stuff about how Trump was a climate change denier and how climate change 100% undeniably is the cause of human impact. But then I did find a speck of truth within that class, Mark. And one of they went through the top 3 factors of what causes pollution from all of these countries. And one of the things that they said, one of these factors is lack of wealth, lack of ability to sustain yourself. People will chop down trees for firewood. They'll kill endangered animals for money and for food. And I found that really, really, really interesting. Affluence, like you said, it creates less pollution. So one of the things that the left doesn't realize is by taking away all of these, I guess you could say, non-renewable energy sources like oil and coal from a lot of these third world nations, or at least trying to egg them on to reduce their share. There are about 1 billion people, I think a little over 1 billion people in the world who rely on these non-renewable resources just to live. You take that away, nothing's going to change. In fact, you're just going to cause more deaths than would ever be the result of pollution or climate change. So I find it really interesting that the left likes to demonize wealth, but wealth solves a lot of the problems in society that they complain about.
This is true, but I don't look at the left as particularly introspective, and I don't expect them to see this paradox in their thinking.
So I know you're glad that Trump pulled out of the Paris Accords. So what do you think the whole motivation behind making climate change, they're not just a religion, but a cult on the left? What do you think their motivation for that is? Why are they so interested in keeping these climate change alarmists in the fore of their ideology?
Because it's an ever-morphable scenario, and it's an ever-morphable character that can be used in an infinite number of ways to deprive people of right. It's a silent thing, and most of the arguments for its existence come from arguments of authority, where we are simply to obey the edicts of a certain number of scientists who are endowed with the knowledge, and we're supposed to act in whatever way they tell us. This is a completely plastic issue that can be manipulated to mean anything at any time. It's a rubber issue, I could say, instead of plastic. It can mean anything at any time. But the overarching purpose, I think, to manipulate this rubber issue is to disseminate socialistic, centralized ways of doing business, is to take away property and control and to invest it in the state. That's its overarching enemy is capitalism, and its overarching end is some means of central planning and control. It's anti-individualistic, it's pro-collectivistic, and it can mean anything in favor of collectivism. Did I make myself clear there?
You did. It essentially it perpetuates government control of the individual.
Right, and on the one hand, it's global warming, then it's climate change. Now, there's nothing more ambiguous than that. It can mean anything at any time, and all you have to do, since you've set up this sort of idea that these authorities pass judgment that we're supposed to obey without question, is set up some authority who will pronounce an edict that we're supposed to obey without question, and suddenly you've lost a little more of your individualism, and collectivism has gained one more step towards advancing its agenda. So, yeah, man, I don't trust it. There's a couple of good books with regard to the environmentalist movement. One is called Eco-Imperialism by Paul Dreesen. If you want to see just how dreadful and disgusting and anti-human these environmentalist movements are, and I sort of know that from the inside. I worked with an environmentalist organization for a short time. I did door-to-door sales for them, and I know the junk science that they use to stir up people's emotions and get them acting and not thinking. So that's a good book. There's another one called Merchants of Despair by Robert Zubrin, which is very good. And there's another book by Andrew Bernstein, who wrote our party platform, called Capitalist Solutions. And about a good quarter of the book, he addresses how through capitalism to address environmental problems.
I'll make sure to give those a read. And anyone out there who heard those, go give them a read. I love reading books that debunk climate change. I've read a few. I was forced to for environmental science. I was forced to read a few books that stated, essentially, they all state the same argument too. It's not even just that they state the same argument. They all use the same numbers. They all use the same statistics. There's no variation in their arguments. It's one thing. And if you debunk or you contradict that one thing, you are anti-science. So I love reading books that debunk their arguments, and I do love to see their subsequent reactions when those books end up debunking their whole message of government control. But I did want to ask you about one last thing. It's kind of the last topic I wanted to go over today, unless you had anything else you wanted to bring up after this. And I don't think I brought it up to you at all before the show in the list of topics. I just want to see what you think about this. I know you're a pretty avid supporter of Israel and that they're their own country, they have a right to exist, and you get a lot of. I've seen you before in Twitter debates, and we've talked about it privately a little bit. You always get someone tries to drag you. Dragging means annihilate you in a debate. And you always drag them back, but someone always tries to come at you or calls you Islamophobic when you say that you support the state of Israel. Why do you support the state of Israel? Why do you think they have a right to exist?
Well, let me just address the Islamophobic thing first. I think that Israel is probably the only place in the Middle East where Muslims could live in total peace with 5 other religions. I don't think you could find that phenomenon anywhere else in the Middle East, where Sunni and Shia are murdering each other, and fundamentalist Islamicists are killing peaceful Muslims by the droves and enslaving them and practicing all manner of barbarities on people. So just the idea that somebody would call me an Islamophobe for supporting Israel is to me shows me how utterly stupid they are. And having been to Haifa, where 5 religions coexist with each other, and within sight of these 5 religions is an encampment of Hezbollah, the utter embodiment of intolerance and brutality. Just what defines Israel as even greater in even greater proportions. But to me, a government's right to exist, or a state's right to exist, because that's what it is, right? A government is just a geographic area that holds to a particular ideology. Well, to me, Israel's right to exist comes from the fact that it accepts the precepts of Western civilization as its guiding premises, So the fact that even though there's no constitution, it's governed by common law, the common law is meant to protect the rights of the individual and some of the basic tenets of civilization: freedom of religion and conscience, free speech and assembly. All of these things were the discoveries over the last 400 or 500 years that changed the nature of the individual to his government and his state, and it made the individual the primary entity in the state, the servant of that person by protecting his rights. And there is no other state in the entire region that even makes a pretense at protecting the rights, the conscience, and the liberties of the individual. I don't think there's another state surrounding Israel where a gay man or woman could live in peace, where somebody of an opposing faith to Islam could live in peace without minimally being taxed or having their places of worship destroyed. So to me, it embraces Enlightenment principles to the largest degree of any country in that area. And as a result of that, it deserves my support as a lover of individualism and freedom. And look, the Middle Eastern community should be looking to it as an inspiration, not as a thing to wipe out. But they can't. They don't have the introspection to do it. And that's why I think Israel is a thorn in the conscience of the Middle East, because it shows that it's possible.
So, I totally agree with you there, and that was a very eloquent and actually kind of perfect answer, but we see the left in America now being extremely hostile to, and I assume this is probably one of the places where you align more with conservatives, because you see the left being extremely hostile toward Israel for no conceivable reason, in taking the side of Palestine and terroristic governments within that tiny little Palestinian area. So,
I think there's a conceivable reason. It's not conceivable to me or you, but I think leftism is very concrete. When they see disparities of any kind, they presume injustice to be the cause of a disparity. They don't ask whether the disparity is just or unjust. To them it is by its nature, by the fact that it exists, unjust. I think they also, most leftists, reject Western civilization. Why? Because violence has happened in the course of the westernization of the world, because they judge Western civilization from its inception in religious fundamentalism all the way through the Enlightenment. So it's thousands of years of development. They judge it from the 21st century perspective. And so dislike it profoundly, and they don't like the monopoly of Western ideas over the world, and so they're animated by an anti-Western hatred and by multiculturalism, where every culture is equal and and therefore none should claim ascendancy over another. So those three things, I think, are the reasons they hate Israel. Israel was not on anybody's shit list when they were poor, benighted, and the underdog. Once they became powerful, pretty much after 1967, and once they became wealthy and successful, there's nothing the world hated more than a Jew with a gun. And that's unfortunate. But they also, in becoming rich, materially wealthy, and successful in so many other ways, they became an embodiment of Western civilization and a sort of an indictment against these other cultures that don't take that too well.
Well, I think it also shows, and there is an amount of religion involved in Israel's government. I believe in their own constitution it says that it's a Jewish state, but in terms of a lot of their policy decisions, like economically, in terms of a lot of their strictly domestic policy decisions, like not involving being in constant combatants with the Muslim world, because the Muslim world continues to incite them. You do see a bit of secularism within their government and a bit of secular thought. So I have to ask you really quick, because you've been in Haifa, and I didn't know that, and that's really interesting. Actually, the lone conservative's head, Cassie Dillon, she actually just came back from Haifa. And I asked this question of Ariel Davidson on my other podcast a little while ago, and she answered it just perfectly. But I wanted to see, since you've also been to Israel, what you think of the accusation that the left constantly throws at them of Israel being some sort of apartheid state. Like, does that have any legitimacy to it? What did you see?
I see quite the opposite. And of course, people could say that I was taken on a tour and not allowed to see the parts that would indicate an apartheid state. But once again, it's the left's concrete way of looking at almost every event that enables them to say such a thing. The existence of a wall must mean they're trying to separate themselves as a superior race from others. Or if hiring practices don't meet their evaluation of equity, that must mean there's some kind of apartheid going on. No, the real apartheid is the Palestinian people who don't want to coexist with the Jewish people. They don't want to. They've been offered that solution many times, but don't want it. So when the choice is don't build a wall and people who despise you purely for your ethnicity and beliefs come streaming into your town and murder you, or build a wall and be more circumspect about who you allow in to save the lives of your citizens, which actually is the purpose of your government, then you have to do the latter, and it's not apartheid. The Jewish people, as far as I can tell, are the only ones reaching out to unite with Muslims. And at last I looked, over a million Arabs live in peace in Israel and with full economic and political power, and some even serve on the Knesset, and I'm sure the population would be even greater if they just embraced Israel and the principles that she's governed by, instead of the authoritarianism and religious fanaticism of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and the Arab nationalism that seems to be so rampant in those areas.
Well, I believe it was in 1995, and I may have the wrong year for anyone out there listening. I'm not an expert in Israeli political history, but I think it was in 1995 where basically Congress unilaterally pretty much agreed to move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Israel's actual true capital, Jerusalem. It's the capital they've declared. Palestinians hold no rights over it. It is, in terms of a legal standpoint, even international legal standpoint, it's Israel's. It's just politics that keeps everyone from saying that it is. But we agreed in 1995 to move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And since then, it hasn't happened. I think it's because the act, I heard this from Governor Mike Huckabee, brilliant man, on occasion. He basically said that the act gave the president some sort of contingent to sign a waiver every 6 months that halts the embassy moving and embassy building process. And every president since then has signed that waiver, including President Trump. I mean, I have to ask. It was pretty much passed almost unanimously through the Senate, though, this act. Even though the left has always been against, ideas, certain ideas of freedom and certain ideas of the West, it seems as if they've gotten so much worse in recent years. Because, again, there were a lot of lefties in the Senate at that time. It was something like only 2 senators who really voted against the resolution. So why? I know you said like it's an anti-Western ideals. It's hating the whole idea of individual liberty, and I agree with you. But what's caused the left to shift so radically in such a short amount of time to the point where it was kind of a bipartisan position to support Israel, at least to some extent, to now we hate Israel. Like the left hates Israel, and the right, we love Israel. Like how has that change happened so quickly?
I think we've just had a few generations exposed to state-run schools and statist ideology now coming into their own and occupying the halls of Congress. So you're getting people now who have been raised from the time they're in kindergarten to think that America isn't what it was portrayed to be. It's actually rather evil, and it's. I've actually had young people tell me that capitalism supported slavery, and that slavery is capitalism. And these are kids that are coming up in state-run middle schools and secondary schools and going to college and learning this stuff, and then taking that knowledge or pseudo knowledge into their political jobs in Washington. So, and look, I mean, the Palestinians have done a magnificent job capitalizing on the concrete epistemology of the left. They show numbers of and number disparities of people killed and act as if that means there's been some injustice committed, and they trumpet it from the rooftops. And the West-hating intellectuals feed into that bias. There's a good book about media bias against Israel called David and Goliath, which I recommend everybody read. Puts this entire thing into perspective. But that's why, look, we've had generations of people coming up learning a certain thing, and now it's the backdrop. It's the atmosphere. It's become the atmosphere, and you're the dissenter now if you have an opposing point of view.
So, good answer. And I did want to ask you, what, it came up to me off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I did want to ask you one last question. And this is more of, because it's a really rare opportunity to ask someone in your position this. I'd consider you a movie star, a TV star, a celebrity. And obviously that means, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but obviously that means, at least to some extent, you mingle, talk to, experience the culture of that Hollywood leftist elite that a lot of people seem to talk about. What is that experience like for you? Like, how are your ideas met with hostility from people? Are they accepted by people within that. I'd call it a toxic Hollywood culture or toxic celebrity culture overall. How do you fare as more of not right wing, but more of a right leaning, freedom loving, individual rights supporting individual?
Well, I mean, I think for the most part, it remains to be seen. Since I've only, it's not that I hid my point of view for years. I was always vocal about what I thought on set. But now social media has given me a platform since 2013 to be very vocal and to reach a large audience. And that also has reverberations, I think, in in my world, where people who are offering you a job now look to your social media to see if they're interested in hiring you for whatever reason. So the repercussions of my political stances have yet to be seen. But I don't, since I don't fall into the kind of categories that the left could easily use to beat me up with. And since I take back the mantle of liberalism from them, I refuse to call people on the left liberals. I'm a liberal. And I found that taking that moral high ground does a great deal towards changing the minds of people in Hollywood who are on the left. And I've actually turned a number of people around on the set, having these kinds of talks with them, and I'm sort of proud of that, because I get them to see things in a way that they hadn't seen them before. So I think in my position as a liberal, a classical liberal in Hollywood, I'm in a unique enough place to not be rejected because I'm not a conservative, and to leave them somewhat open to the things that I have to say, because I certainly don't adopt any of the social issues that conservatives adopt, which bothers a lot of leftists and gives them a little bit of moral ammunition against the right. In fact, it constitutes almost all of their ammunition against the right.
Well, Mark, that was an awesome answer. Thank you so much. You know, you're a celebrity who I see not constantly using his platform, and by using your platform, I mean when you're on TV or when you're in movies, to really express a political message. And